Welcome to the Urban Tourism Podcast, which is a part of the Expertise Network Sustainable Urban Tourism. This is where researchers and practitioners come together to explore how we can transform urban tourism into something that works not just for visitors, but also for local communities and the environment. In this episode, we'll talk about aviation. In the past 20 years, cheap flights have made quick city trips more accessible than ever. This has led to higher visitor pressure in certain city destinations, but the increase of city trips by plane also brings major environmental challenges. So if urban tourism is to become more sustainable, aviation must be part of the conversation. In this podcast, we will do this by looking at this topic with an emphasis on how we can make the sector more sustainable and how we can still enjoy tourism with less air miles. Now, to do that, we have two guests digitally this time around, because one of them is in the UK and we are in the Netherlands, and the other guest is also digitally. She is in the Netherlands, but we have a train strike, so we do it digitally this time around. Doesn't matter at all, because it's still excellent guests, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you. But let's start with the first guest, Tierney Smith. You work as Head of Communications at Climate Catalyst, where you seek to accelerate the transition towards sustainable aviation. Can you tell us something about yourself, what you do, what your work is, and also something we don't know, but that we really should know?
Great, thanks for having me on this podcast today. So I've been working in climate communications for around 15 years now. Started my life out as a journalist, following international climate processes, and so basically following the UN FCCC around, and then moved into the NGO space, working on various kind of areas of climate change, from international policy to grassroots campaigning, to business and investor advocacy. And now, as you said, I'm head of communications at Climate Catalyst. We like to focus on what I like to call trickier climate challenges, so often looking at how we work to decarbonise some of those really hard to tackle sectors. And at the moment, that means I spend most of my time thinking about either aviation or steel at the moment. And I'm very interested in thinking about the stories that we tell about climate change. I think stories are really powerful. They really help shape the way that we see and we think about the world. And I'm particularly keen to explore how we can tell more effective stories to help us kind of drive climate action. And I guess what you should know about me is when I'm not sat at my computer, I'm often out running on the roads and trails in Bristol. Very keen runner. Just run my third marathon. So
nice. Thank you very much for that, Tierney. Jimena Diamint, you're the second guest that we have. You're a researcher at Inholland University of Applied Sciences, and you're a part of the movement Call Aviation to Action, which we'll hopefully talk a bit more about later as well. Can you tell me a bit more about yourself, what you're doing, what very shortly Call Aviation to Action is, and something that we do not know, but we really should know?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Ko, for the little intro and for having me on the podcast. I started my professional journey at Air France KLM, working in the Air France KLM group in Brazil in digital marketing. And there I was really amazed by the whole aviation universe and how it's really the backbone of our current society, how we connect people from all over the world. But at the same time, I was very distressed about the climate impacts that it has and that it brings. And that brought me to kind of try to change careers and go to study again. That's where I did a master's in tourism, society and environment at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, with the idea to research how to transform the aviation system into a more sustainable one through a social science perspective. So nowadays, indeed, I work as a researcher with Ko at Inholland, mainly researching how to transform the travel and tourism industry into a more sustainable one. I think that's my main focus at the moment. And through this extreme concern about the environment and linked with aviation, I started, I co-founded this initiative called Call Aviation to Action, that indeed we will explain later, I think, in more detail. But the idea being to change the aviation system from the inside. And I think something to know from me is that while the topic that worries me most at the moment is climate change, both in my professional, also personal life. I'm also a big fan of traveling, and I love flying as well. I don't do it as much because of how impactful and bad it is for the environment, but I completely understand people that keep on flying and want to, because I am one of those. I mean, it's hard to let go of things that you really like.
That's a great one, and it's very recognizable. Like, you can be seeing the issues with something and still enjoy the practice itself. So yeah, it's good to hear. I don't know if it's good to hear, but it's interesting to hear. Let's start. Like, it's first, when we talk about this, I think the first thing we need to ascertain is okay, why are we talking about this? And of course, most of us are in a little tourism bubble, so we hear a lot about aviation and the climate crisis. But I was wondering, in the grand scheme of things, Tierney, can you tell me something about how bad is it with flying? What is the contribution of aviation and tourism towards the climate crisis with regards to other aspects?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, aviation is responsible for about 5% of global warming. It's responsible for around 2.5% of all of our carbon emissions, but it also emits sort of other greenhouse gases as well, such as soot and water vapor, and those are also contributing to warming, which is why it's a kind of bigger chunk of warming overall. And this definitely makes it a highly polluting sector. It's definitely not the most polluting sector, but it's a high polluting sector. I think a good comparison, for example, is the steel sector is responsible for around 10% of emissions, and cement, say, around 8%. So it's up there with some of the other kind of high polluting industries. But I think the bigger issue when we're thinking about aviation is actually the projected growth that we're expected to see from aviation. So compared to a lot of other sectors where we're starting to see a decline in emissions because we're seeing improvements in things like efficiency and the technologies that are being used, aviation emissions are actually set to grow a lot in the coming years, partly due to a huge increase in potential passenger numbers. So, for example, in Europe alone, we could see some 660,000 more people flying every year by 2040. And that's not to mention the sort of growth that we expect to see in other regions as well, for example, Asia. And with that all in mind, we're looking at aviation actually being somewhere more towards 20+% of carbon emissions by 2050. So what we've got at the moment is that the action that is happening to tackle emissions within the aviation sector isn't keeping up with that projected growth, and that poses a huge risk to our ability generally to tackle the climate crisis.
Nice. It's good to put it in that kind of a perspective, that we can see its current share of the emissions, or of the carbon emissions, but also that growth projection, because I think that is really where I think the great worry is with aviation. And I think you can also see that in the wider environment. I think, I'm looking back in my personal memory, about 20 years ago I started in tourism, and I looked at the climate impact of tourism. And then it really was just a couple of researchers, some NGOs that really looked into this and took it as a serious issue. This is pre-Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. Different world. But what I've seen in the last years is that even from within the industry, there are now voices saying, look, we need to take this seriously. This is something that is something we cannot ignore. And I think that is something that we've really seen coming up in recent years. I think, Jimena, your initiative, Call Aviation to Action, is part of that new group of people engaging with the discussion. Can you tell us some more about the organization, the initiative, what it is and what you do?
Yeah, so Call Aviation to Action is basically a movement started by a couple of current and former aviation professionals that are really concerned about the impact that aviation has, and also about the current plans the aviation industry has to tackle this emissions problem. We've launched the movement quite recently. We already have around 400 supporters and signees, all people coming from the aviation industry, or majorly people coming from the aviation industry, actually. And our main message is that we love aviation. We really see the value of the aviation industry in connecting people and connecting the world. However, we do need a fundamental transition of business plans to achieve the emission reductions needed to keep the aviation industry relevant in and within planetary boundaries. So yeah, I think I just wanted to talk about kind of what are we actually proposing with this initiative. And we've come up with 4 different, I think, key actions that need to be taken into account by the aviation industry as a whole if we want to keep it in a net zero path. So they are setting absolute emission reduction targets in line with carbon budgets. So agreeing to that in a global way across the industry, advocating for and helping to implement regulation that keeps us within planetary boundaries and really drives innovation instead of advocating against, which is what we see that happens at the moment. To be realistic on the timeline of what technology can bring. And I think this is a pretty big issue with the aviation industry, where technology just keeps being boasted as the one solution that will help us. And we really need to keep in mind that there is a limit because we need to bend the curve in a definite time. And lastly, and very importantly, acknowledging that managing demand in a fair manner is part of the solution. And this managing demand would be in like global, international, and local way. And we've really seen that this has a lot of support. I mean, people from the aviation industry that have signed up at pilots and engineers, managers, you have people from boardrooms and sustainability experts, really people that are working across the aviation ecosystem. So it's really, I think, that the silent majority that has now been able to come up and talk about their issues.
That was what I was wondering about. Like, how are you perceived by both the industry, but also by the environmental movements, who might see you as like, what is this? This is it's in essence, it's a strange, new perspective on this this issue. So how have you been perceived?
Yeah, I think that we've started this movement because we've seen that this is a position that is shared by a lot of people within the industry. Environmental movements have targeted the aviation as one of the key pillars to like decarbonize and to achieve a decarbonized society, which there's a lot of right in that. And what we're doing is seeing aviation professionals as allies in this quest, because at the end it comes from the idea that we all want a better future ahead. And people that work in the industry are part of that. And that shows a bit in the numbers that we've achieved. Like from a week after we launched, I think we already had like 200 signees, and now a month after we have 400 people supporting us, being part of this community. And that is mainly within Europe still. We haven't really crossed borders outside of Europe so much. So we really do think, and kind of the numbers show that we have a lot of people that do support us in that. And I think that there's a bit of a different perception that comes from within the corporations themselves. We've heard a bit aviation organizations that are not so happy about our movement, or they're very distrustful of it. We've heard that communications has been circulated around discouraging their own employees to sign up for a community, which is of course very interesting because we don't want to be against it. I think what we're trying to do is tap into the underlying wish that everybody has, is to have a better planet.
And it's fascinating to hear that you have both these positive and these negative reactions. Tierney, you probably have seen this kind of reaction to initiatives to become more sustainable, both within aviation but also in other industries. How do you react to this when you hear this story? Like, does it give recognition, or are you surprised by it all?
No, I'm probably not surprised by it, but I also think that's why this voice is also so important to have in the discussion, right? Because I think otherwise what you see is it's kind of civil society and green organizations going against corporations and stuff, which is the same old tale that has played out for as long as we've been working in these issues. But actually what's really interesting about what this movement is doing is it's people from within the sector, people that have a good understanding of the sector, and as Jimena said, like people who want a future for this sector, but they want it to be done in a really sustainable way. And those are such a critical voice within this discussion. We really need to be bringing those in. And so, yeah, from my perspective, I think it's great to have this kind of addition to what we're working on, where it's people that understand the sector, have lived in the sector, and still love the sector, to be able to be adding that really powerful call for change to be happening. But yes, sadly, doesn't surprise me that maybe there's then some disconnect between them and some of the corporates at large.
Yeah, I guess this is always the issue. Change ruffles some feathers, and well, we see some feathers being ruffled. At the same time, it is very interesting to see that this is really it's not a new voice, but it's a different perspective now coming through, and hopefully that can help us come up with new ways of creating change. Because in the past 20 years, not to be too depressing, but I've not seen the greatest changes when it comes to aviation's climate impact. And it's largely to do with, yes, we have got more efficient planes, but it's also has to do just with more people flying. So this is a very difficult sector on that matter, as you were already saying, Tierney. But now let's look at some solutions. For a long time, we've been now hearing about more technological solutions, but also other innovations like improving rail travel, or finding new ways of flying, new fuels, new electric flying, hydrogen flying. Well, let's peel them off for a second. Let's do you, Jimena. Railways, is that a credible solution to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking rail versus air travel, and if you're focusing on Europe, I would say rail is definitely a nice solution to the problem. We do have a lot of constraints, I think, that impede that a bit. So basically, the capacity of rail to actually absorb the whole demand from air travel is very limited. There's already, I think, a lot of rail infrastructure is basically at capacity or reaching capacity, and a lot of investment needs to be done. So there's definitely constraints also in terms of price. I think price points is one of the defining factors in choosing a transport mode for travelers. If you look at what a plane ticket and a train ticket cost to the same destination, it's train tickets are always, of course, more expensive, where it shouldn't really be. I mean, the amount of energy that takes flying a plane and driving a train, the plane takes way more energy. So in that sense, we have set up an infrastructure and a whole system of rules that doesn't really make sense to what we actually need to bring us towards a better future, a better transport system. Though when we are talking about rail travel that's beyond Europe, that becomes way more complicated. So in Latin America, for instance, or Brazil, where I come from, we don't have a rail infrastructure in place, and we have a continental size of a country. So everything needs to be built from scratch, and then environmental impacts of rail are also quite damaging. But at the same time, we just need to think about different possibilities and think further ahead, because growing air travel is really not the way to go.
And at the same time, I mean, I can hear what you're saying. Like it is, within Europe, it's already very difficult, even with a good infrastructure that is lying around, or reasonably good infrastructure. But if you go to places, like Brazil, which are continents upon themselves, within themselves, it becomes even harder. And of course, big catch out. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Like there's lots of things that need to be happening at the same time. And it's useful to see, like, may have a role then, this whole train, railway perspective, but it's not, well, the only solution or the solution. Another solution, which, well, I hear an awful lot about at the moment, are sustainable aviation fuels. And Tierney, that's also mentioned in several of your reports. You discuss sustainable aviation fuels. Please tell me, this is the way out. This is it. We're there.
Maybe not. I think the key thing to think about and to keep in mind when we talk about what is classed as sustainable aviation fuels is that actually what we're talking about is we've got one term that actually talks about a huge bucket of different options. And some of those are more sustainable and some of them are less sustainable than maybe they first appear. So I think most of the time when we're talking about sustainable aviation fuel at the moment, what we're currently actually talking about is biofuels. And these can come from a couple of different sources, but the one that people are probably very familiar with is kind of crop-based biofuels. So these come from things like corn or sugarcane, for example. And they've got quite a bad reputation in recent years, and I would say rightly so. They've been linked with kind of huge environmental impacts, such as reduced biodiversity. They often displace crops that could be used for food, so they've got implications for food security. And they've also been linked with some human rights issues, such as land grabs. And I think the other thing to remember when we're talking about these fuels is they don't reduce carbon emissions to zero. Actually, when we're thinking about crop-based fuels, they're actually only really reducing emissions by about 55%. So it's a reduction, but it's not getting us to zero. Then we have what we would call waste-based biofuels. So these often come from things like cooking oils or animal fats, for example. They don't have the same implications for biodiversity and things like that as crop-based fuels do. And their emissions potential depends on the type of fuel you're using, but could be anything from sort of 25% emissions reductions to 75% emissions reductions. But I think the thing to note with waste-based fuels is that we actually only have a limited amount of waste. And, we're seeing action around the world to try and build more circularity into our systems and to actually reduce waste further. So there's only kind of a limited amount of waste that we can use for these fuels, and often they can also be used for other things. So there may be the demand is maybe not quite there. Also, the other thing to note is that it's often hard to trace where these fuels are coming from. So we've got a risk of things like virgin palm oil, for example, being passed off as cooking oils. So there's also another risk there. So those fuels definitely have a role, but it might be fairly limited, and we don't want to lock ourselves into kind of unsustainable practices in terms of the waste that we're generating. And then finally, we have what we would call e-kerosene. This is referred to with lots of different terms. It's often called power to liquid or synthetic fuels. And these have kind of key three inputs to them. That's hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and renewable energy. We would consider these sort of the highest integrity fuels because they don't come with some of those same challenges that biofuels come with. And also they can reduce carbon emissions from between about 75% and 98%. So they've got a higher reduction potential as well. But there are still a few things to consider because nothing's ever simple. Firstly, if we're using hydrogen and we want this to be green hydrogen, this basically means hydrogen coming from renewable energy sources. And the carbon dioxide used also needs to be responsibly sourced. The ideal option for this would be what we call direct air capture. This is essentially where you pass air through giant fans and you remove the carbon dioxide and capture and store that rather than allowing it to go into the atmosphere where it's contributing more to climate change. But a lot of these technologies are still in their infancy. And the kind of production of these fuels is only really suited to areas where we've got a lot of renewable energy and a lot of land. It's also really important that when we think about the renewable energy that's going to be going into these fuels, that's not displacing renewable energy that we really need for other urgent kind of decarbonisation efforts, so decarbonising our grid and different things like that. So it's got to be a kind of additional renewable energy. And also we don't want the production of these fuels to be kind of linked to impacts on biodiversity or the removal of natural stores of carbon like forests because of land use change for their production. So while there's potential for these fuels as well, they could have a really important role to play in aviation. They don't come without their challenges. But I think the thing to really talk about is the fact that today, less than 1% of all the fuel we use in aviation comes from these. And this is still primarily coming from biofuels. So those kind of lower integrity options. We've seen some really good work to kind of boost this, particularly in Europe. We've got some really interesting mandates that have come in this year in both the EU, but also the UK and Norway, that are really starting to try and kickstart the SAF industry. And most of these do include sub-targets for e-kerosene, so they do include a requirement on those higher integrity fuels. And basically what these are doing is they're meaning that current fuel providers, mainly oil majors at the moment, now have to supply SAF. Or they face a penalty, and also the airports need to provide this fuel for airlines to buy and to use. Though at the moment there are very few of these plants in Europe, and most of the targets is actually being met by imports. And most of that again is coming from those waste-based biofuels, so not quite getting there at the moment. It is slowly growing, but it's definitely kind of a trickle into the market at the moment. And many of these plants, they take several years to come online and to get to the point where they are producing fuels. So we really need to think about this in terms of the long term. And we've been seeing current fuel producers, again, the oil majors such as BP and Shell, have been pausing and quitting the development of some of these plants in Europe recently. So that means there's growing concerns that maybe these mandates aren't necessarily going to be met. So the measures are in place, but whether we're going to meet them is still a little bit unsure, which I think, it shows that SAF can be part of it. It is part of the solution. It is one of the ways that we might be able to get out of this challenge. But I think it really brings us back to this idea that actually another core thing that we just really need to do is reduce the demand for flying. A lot of these technologies are gonna take a while to come online, and the only real way to think about how we tackle emissions in the very near term is to look at how do we remove the most kind of excessive amounts of flying, your use of private jet, business users, etc. How do we kind of reduce that now? We, as Jimena said, the reality is that we all really love to fly. Aviation is going to remain a really important part of society, but we can't see the projected growth that we're expecting in the sector. While we're going to need to see that overall demand come down while we then look at decarbonising what remains. Alternative fuels can help, and innovation is also needed, but that has to come together with demand reduction and improvement of things like railways and alternatives.
Yeah, no, I think you're saying very true things there, and particularly the part when you say even with technological solutions you need those social change like demand reduction, but also how do you instigate, how do you ensure that for example with regards to e-fuels that they are actually produced, even when the technological possibilities may be there. And I think from my understanding the same goes largely for electric flying, for hydrogen flying. They're very interesting solutions for a certain point, for the certain service, certain element of the industry, but it's not going to be sufficient to just technologify, that's not good English, but you know what I mean, our way out of this palaver. So actually I think probably it's more fun and more interesting to talk about social political solutions and how do we create, what did you say, reduce demand management or reduce demand. Jimena, do you have ideas on what could we do to just reduce demand in a way that even people like yourself who love flying will take that on board?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
I'm sorry, it is, but
I think there are many ideas like being floated around in this topic. One of those is taxation. So increasing tax on flying, making flying more expensive, therefore making less attractive. The issue with just increasing tax on flying is that you can make it basically more expensive for people that don't fly as much, and then the ultra rich who are not affected by taxes will not be touched by those. So I think a good idea in that sense is a frequent flyer levy, who basically taxes in an exponentially progressive way the amount of flights a person takes. And in my opinion, for this to be somewhere more effective and actually touch upon the people that fly more, because mind you, there's only around 11% of the world population that has ever taken a flight, and 1% of this, 1% of the population actually emits 50% of the emissions from flying. So this 1% is we can really consider to be like the hyper rich or the super intense business flyers who are hardly touched by taxes. So in that sense, in my opinion, for a tax like that to have some sort of potential to diminish the flying of this 1% is to create absurdly exponential taxes. And this needs to be done in the amount of flights, not in the mileage, because you can also run into a climate issue situation if you consider flight distance to put taxes. Because of course you have a lot of migrants that need to fly from across the world to visit their families. And so that's why indeed doing it per distance is not really the most just way, I would say. But if you increase the flights exponentially per number of flight a person takes per year, then there's possibly a path there to make it a bit more just and try to reduce demand a bit.
No,
that I think is, yeah?
No, go for it.
Well, that I think is a really good way. And another thing that I think we really should start thinking about is capping numbers of flights. I mean, and this needs to be done in Call Aviation to Action. We talk about as one of the 4 points for kind of a path towards a climate possible future for aviation is to actively manage demand in a fair way, and fair considering and global, like international and local way. So we cannot just cap flights everywhere in the world in the same way. We need to consider that there are some countries that still need to develop sort of some flying infrastructure that maybe should not be capped at this point, but Europe, who has developed it a lot, and basically most flights come and go from Europe and from the US. Perhaps we could limit flights in Europe way more. It's absurd, I think, for me to consider that airport expansion is still a thing in Europe.
Yeah, so there's, I see two ways, and both try to restrict or limit either via taxation or just not building expansions. To limit the growth of demand and the growth of flying. Tierney, I was wondering, like, as you said just earlier, like that you are also your catalyst is also carbon catalyst is also about changing narratives, changing stories, and I think you need a pretty good story to sell this one. How are we going to sell this? Because I can totally imagine that a lot of people would say, yeah, not in my backyard, or not at all.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think a lot of it does come back to how we're talking about this and the stories that we tell. And I think that's one of the key things that's also really blocked progress to date, you know, particularly in Europe. The dominant narrative that we are hearing all the time is kind of focused on two things. Firstly, that technology alone is going to get us out of this and fix this challenge, which, you know, as we've talked about, there are limitations and challenges to doing that. And secondly is that any of these measures to address kind of fossil fuel use in aviation or excessive flights is seen as a kind of tax on holidays or a tax on freedoms. And these narratives are very much being pushed by industry. They're being then repeated by politicians. And this has really shut down the space for us to be able to have a real conversation about this topic and about what we do differently. I do think there are really great ways that we can think about changing these narratives. And actually, this is essentially what I've been looking into for the last 18 months of my life, has been very much focused on this. And we've been very much looking at how do we tap into values and to the things that people really care about, and how do we then bring that into the conversation around aviation, particularly to audiences that maybe we haven't engaged before. So we very much focus on what we like to call a persuadables audience, which was a term that's been coined by an organisation in the UK called Climate Labs, who we've been working really closely with. And essentially this is what we like to call the silent majority. You know, this is they're not your climate activists, they're not your climate skeptics, they're everyone kind of in the middle. And all the research shows that they really care about climate change, but they're broadly supportive of action, but they've had minimal engagement on this issue. So it's like, how do we talk to them? How do we unlock action with them? How do we shift the conversation with that broad section of society? And I think there is a lot of really interesting hooks that we can use. And I think to this point around fairness and inequality within aviation, you know, the majority of people don't understand that actually it's 1% of the population that are responsible for 50% of emissions coming from flying. You know, when they hear about these measures that are going to be tackling this, they see how it might impact them. But actually with things like a frequent flyer levy or a super tax on private jets or a ban on private jets or different things like that, what we're really showing is we're not trying to hit you as an individual who just wants to take their family on holiday or just wants to go visit their family in another country. But what we're trying to do is really readdress the imbalance that is already there, and really trying to make sure that those who are flying the most and those who are polluting the most are paying the most. And I think that is something that would really resonate with people. One of the things that we found people really, really responded to well was this idea that for a lot of us, when you go and say put petrol in your car, you're paying a tax on that, and because it's a fossil fuel. But actually airlines aren't paying the same on kerosene. Now that's mad. That's a system where we're continuing to allow fossil fuels to dominate, and we're giving fossil fuels subsidies to be able to do so. And that's what we really need to disrupt. And so when we can start talking to people in those terms, in terms of fairness, in terms of community, you know, the health and noise impacts of airports, and airport expansion, and how that's impacting people who really, you know, don't necessarily have a choice in that matter when suddenly an airport is expanding into their backyard, essentially. You know, when we can start to talk to people on those levels, then I think there's real good opportunities to break through and try and shift that conversation a little bit.
And if we make that a bit more precise, like shift the narrative, talk with people on those levels, as you were saying, how do we actually do that? Like, how do you reach people? Because you can put an online platform in there, but who will look at it? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, so I think it's no surprise that fossil fuel industry and the airline industry, the aviation industry, are spending, you know, millions and billions of pounds and dollars and euros on advertising every single year. You know, they're doing it because that works, right? So they are going out there and they are constantly selling us this idea that flying is normal and that it's aspirational. And that needs to stop. We need to think about how we prevent those messages from being out there. And there's really interesting work happening at the moment on thinking about how we phase out advertising for fossil fuels and how we phase out advertising for high carbon products, so aviation as well as sort of cars and different things like that. So just making sure that those messages aren't getting to people, but also how do we reach people in those same spaces? Because actually one of the things that we know is that, you know, a lot of people don't have a lot of time to engage with the news. They don't necessarily engage with a lot of those channels that we would traditionally be trying to reach them on. We're more likely to find those people in the kind of cultural media spaces, because also that's where we form our opinions, right? We form our opinions when we're sat around the TV with our family, or when we're out and about and seeing billboards and different things like that. That's where we're kind of building our kind of opinions. So how do we reach people there? And I think it's by us moving into those spaces that have traditionally been dominated by the kind of companies and fossil fuels, etc. And how do we think about, could we more creatively use advertising space or TV, or get storylines placed in dramas or films, for example, where we're talking about these issues, where we're really starting to reach people in the spaces that they are with the stories that we really want to tell them. So I think it's first understanding what resonates and what those stories are and how we should be talking to people. And then secondly, just making sure that we're tapping into those spaces where people are accessing this information.
And could I add to that, Ko?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think I really liked what Tierney's story about the persuadables and the silent majority, because it's really what we're also aiming at with Call Aviation to Action, bring the silent majority of aviation professionals to speak up and really talk about these topics, really realizing that there is a lot of people around there that are worried about the environment and can actually act on it. And with this initiative, it's also about building a safe space for the people that might be worried, might already have this awareness, but don't feel safe enough to speak up because their jobs are on the line. Because this is a sector that has been pressured a lot from the outside. Therefore, it's quite offensive at the moment from anything that will kind of target their position, or as they see kind of the business as usual being threatened in any way. So what we see also in a way to bring the conversation forward is to have these kind of influential voices within the aviation industry to speak up. So maybe a manager in your in an airport company, an airport group, or in a sustainability expert in Boeing kind of speaking up and saying, hey, everybody below me can also then speak up and talk about it. And another great idea is just to, I guess, bring the conversation in these spaces by discussing it in the next team meeting. So we are asking then our signatories to, if next time you have a one-on-one with your supervisor, just bring this up, talk about Call Aviation to Action and what it made you think about and your concerns about the aviation industry and how you would see a different path forward. So I think a lot of times the problem is that we are not daring to speak about this in environments where we don't think we're going to be accepted, or where our messaging is not really going to be well received. So I think there's a lot of courage needed in those more kind of traditional fuel-based companies to talk about the problem and to see that we're together. We need to collaborate to find a solution.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to see like the two different perspectives. Like for consumers, you need these new narratives in new ways that people will actually be able to engage with them. And within the industry itself, it's actually also very useful to stimulate courage and to create that safe space where it is possible to talk about it. Because I can totally understand, indeed, like you're saying, it is very tricky if your livelihood depends on it, to actually start being critical of this, or being what is perceived as being critical of it, because of course it's not. It comes from a place of like trying to improve things. And in essence, when it comes to the public, to quickly go back to that, Tierney, because one thing that I'm always wondering about is, I'm not a big social media guru, but I do see it as very influential in the media sphere, or just public sphere, even political sphere nowadays, of course. Is that not a place where there's a lot of room for new voices to be heard? We may not agree with a lot of them. We may agree with a lot of them. Depends on where you are. But there is maybe a different way of reaching people. Have you worked on that? Thought of that?
Yeah, so I think digital also definitely has a role to play, for sure. And I think, as you say, there are a lot of people are quite influenced now by what they see in the digital space. And as you say, there's a lot of voices out there that maybe we don't agree with, but I think there's a lot that we can do there in terms of bringing voices into that discussion. Yeah, so it definitely has a role. I don't think it's the only role, and I think we should be looking at kind of all opportunities to reach people, particularly when we think about things like where we might want to spend money to reach people, because while digital is very influential, digital advertising maybe a little bit less so. It can be maybe a little bit less trusted compared to, say, billboard advertising or radio or TV advertising, for example. So I think there's different ways to engage with different platforms. But ultimately, I think we really need to be reaching everyone everywhere we can at this point, because also, there's a really great stat that one of our partners told me, where they were saying, how often does someone need to hear something before they really remember it? And I think it's something like 10 times. So, if we can reach people in multiple different locations, and we can continue to reach them with the same messages and the same stories, then that's when they really start to resonate, and that's when they really start to be remembered. So yes, digital has a role, but I think there's a lot of different media spaces that we should be looking at using.
Yeah, and Jimena, to you in a way, a similar question. Like, in what way could we use new means of communication? It doesn't have to be like social media or digital means, but new ways of engaging with people. How do you create safe spaces for people who would like to talk about this? Do you have ideas of that?
Well, I think maybe I would switch that question around, because I think sometimes new ideas, we don't always need to run towards the new and shiny thing. So I like a lot this like banned fossil fuels advertising movement, because it's bringing attention back into the streets and back into like human to human connection as well. So maybe instead of thinking about new innovative ways, we can go back to kind of old ways of like reaching out to colleagues, co-workers, friends and family that may not agree with us. I think bringing it back to kind of the social component of reaching out to the person next to us and talking about that.
Yeah, and having a true conversation about these things rather than an argument.
Yeah. I'd also just add to that, like, I think that's something that I find really fascinating about, I feel like so much of what we absorb and what we get is people trying to sell us products, right? So whether it's a flight or whatever it might be, it's constantly people trying to sell us things and to make us think that our life is going to be better if we do this or have that, etc. And I really like this idea of, like, what if we took those spaces that are traditionally used to sell us things and instead try and, like, sell ideas and sell stories and sell change and sell hope as well. Everything feels so depressing these days, but there's a great movement in Bristol where I live, where different collectives have taken over billboard space for artistry, for different things like that. And it's like taking away that power that people have by using these spaces to influence us into buying the next product, and instead using them something more creative, something more visionary, something more hopeful. I love the idea of just exploring that more.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's super interesting, because it's like the ban fossil ads movement is amazing. And like recently in The Hague, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, they've had success. So fossil ads had been banned from The Hague. But we cannot only be against, we need to provide positive narratives. And I think maybe that's also what you're engaging with, Tierney. There's also a lot of positives in not flying. So it's not only about losing, but about what we can gain from looking at other means of transportation and other ways to look at tourism and travel.
Yeah, can you say something more about that? Like, what kind of positive narratives of change could we use to give that alternative message out to people?
Yeah, when we talk, also we're talking about urban tourism as well, and there's a lot of impact into the most overcrowded cities that comes from flying. And we can change that around. I mean, if we travel in a slower way, we pass by many smaller places that have rich history and that have interesting things to show us. We don't always need to be city hopping from European capital to European capital. But this is a behavioral system change in a way. I mean, coming from Latin America, we really want to explore everything that Europe has to give in 2 weeks' time. So it's all about city hopping, because it's the idea that travel is a right and we need to catch up with the people that have been the most traveled in our society. So there's also this idea of like radical conviviality that invites us to be in way closer contact with the other and with someone from a different culture. Like, I've traveled a lot with my family, and I cannot think of one trip where we've actually connected with a local. I've done that one time by myself, but I think it's very usual that just average people are used to travel and just visiting hotspots and staying kind of in the tourism bubble. And I really wonder what that adds, what that brings. So tourism has this very big discourse of saying, well, traveling is about enhancing culture, it connects people, but I wonder if at the moment that's actually what's happening. And I like a lot the movements that try to bring travelers more in contact with the local people. And yeah, I think perhaps that's a way.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting, because I'm thinking what you're, I think, alluding to is like, because it's also easy, tourism and travel has become like a fast food. It's just something you snack away, and it's not really satisfying, but it's okay. It serves a need. Whereas, of course, so yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, I'd also just add to that. I think we often think about travel as getting from A to B, right? And I think I saw a really interesting video yesterday from a company that does sells train travel. Their whole ethos is traveling by train, and it's about actually how do you make the journey part of it, you know, and their whole thing was like you get more smells, you get more taste, you get more different things by taking it slower, maybe stopping in a couple of cities on the way to your destination, because you're taking it slower and you're doing slower travel by train, rather than this need to, as you said, like hop and see as much as possible at once. Like, how do you actually just slow that down and make the journey part of the experience? And I think that's a very different mindset, right? It's a real shift for people to get their heads around, but those are wonderful stories that we can tell.
Yeah. No, and it's also, I think, the sense of gratification after a long journey, when you actually reach your destination, you do feel like, oh yeah, this is what it's about. It's about like we really are in a different setting now, and it's more difficult to achieve if it's just pop in, pop out. But that's nice, because I think those are useful, hopeful, positive stories. I think that are very, very much needed. And I was also wondering, like, besides, well, you're both providing action from a different perspective, what other kinds of stakeholders could we engage with more within the civil society, amongst consumers, to stimulate more of these positive stories come out? I mean, you've already alluded to this before, but are there other specific people that we should engage more to get this sustainable travel and tourism further on the agenda in a positive way?
I think we need to work together in the tourism industry, in the travel industry, in a big way. I know that there's a lot of focus in the kind of climate movement looking at airlines, for instance. And I don't really think that's the right outlook, because airlines are just one piece of the puzzle. There's also a lot of issues that airlines have to try to be more sustainable. I mean, their margins are super short and tight. So there's not a lot of place they can invest in sustainability. But if we look at transport in a kind of holistic way, then we can combine a lot more, like train travel, air travel, coaches, etc., to try to build kind of a network that serves the climate more. At the same time, if you're looking at tour operators, for instance, and destinations, we need to start considering the climate impact of a tour or of a package, not only from the destination, but also from the origin of a traveler until destination. That has to be counted into how we look at environmental problems. So I think it requires like a very broad and collective way of looking at the issues in our society, not just trying to focus on what's the best for your business, because I think that's very easily then you come into a finger pointing situation where it's like, no, I should not be the one like flying less or doing things lower, you should be. And at the end, we all need to be changing our mindset in order to deal with climate change and all the social problems that come with it.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that you're talking about, like we need to look at the broader ecosystem. It's too easy to just pick one element of it because then you don't get the whole picture. I think related to that, and just thinking of this as you were talking, is, of course, when we talk about tour operators, there's a lot of things that you can also do as a tour operator, as a tourism industry professional, to highlight those very, very special experiences that may be there in smaller cities along the way, in cities nearby, or to try to get people to experience cities for longer so that they have more time on a certain destination. Of course, these things have all been discussed before, but also to look at how can you use those nearby experiences to change your products, to try to move away from a dependency on flying for certain destinations towards more closer by. I'll give an example, like if you're a Japan specialist tour operator, you're not going to change your products very easily. But if it's more of a sun, sea, sand type of tour operator, there might be possibilities to look closer to home and create just as good as, if not better, experiences from elsewhere. Have you thought about how you can engage with those kind of stakeholders to really take them on board as a wider ecosystem?
We've not looked a huge amount at the tourism sector specifically, to be honest, but I do think there's something really interesting in there. And I also think something interesting in there around sort of the people that also enjoy these spaces. So as you were talking, one organisation that popped into my mind is, I don't know if you know an organisation called Protect Our Winters. So they basically set up, they're people that are extreme sport enthusiasts, so skiers and different groups like that. And realizing that actually that had such a huge impact on the environment, and what they were doing was having a huge impact on the environment, but also that those environments that they loved spending time in were going to be hugely impacted by climate change. And so actually they've been able to mobilize a whole completely different group of people to be huge advocates for climate change and huge advocates for how we think about traveling to and being in the spaces that we love. So yeah, I think there's some like really interesting overlaps between tourism, aviation, but just also like other like interesting sectors of society, because aviation really touches on everybody, right?
Yeah. And it's at the same time, like what you're saying, it's interesting because of course, you also have it with city tourism. A lot of city tourism destinations are coastal cities. If we have seawater level rising, we have a problem. So that's also another way of engaging. It's not a very positive one, so we need to find a more positive way of framing that. But it is a different way of engaging. Like, we don't want to lose these lovely city environments that we have. So how can we maintain them in other ways? So I think that's another nice one to frame the narrative differently and move forward. I think because of time, we need to move on to our final section, which has some sets questions that we ask all people on the podcast. And the first one of those is a very simple one. If I ruled the world, question to you: if you were the ruler of the world, what would you do? You could make one change to help make aviation more sustainable or to stimulate the development towards that. What would you do? Jimena.
Maybe I cheat here, but I will have a one policy package, globally adapted, where I think we should really implement frequent flyer levies and a ban for airport expansion, and a cap on flights. I think those are the three things that I look at, as well as a tax on kerosene and
That's
jet
number
fuel.
4. But it's a 4-in-1 package. That's great to hear. Tierney, what would you do?
I would start with banning private jets. I think for me, that's, even though it's a relatively small part of aviation, I think it's a growing part of the problem. And also for me, it gets to the heart of the injustice that there is in this sector and the lack of equity in this sector. The fact that we have people who can hop on their own private jets and cause as much pollution as they do is shocking to me. So that would be my first. But if I could sneak a second one in there, because
Jimena did so.
I'd also ban short haul flights. So similar to the policy that France has recently introduced, where they've banned the use of flights where there is a reasonable train line. I just think, again, it just highlights the excess that there is in this industry. One of my colleagues always likes to talk about the in the UK there's a flight you can get, it's 15 minutes between Manchester and Leeds, and you could drive that in not that much longer. So it's shocking that we can get on flights when there are very, very easy trains that we can do instead. So yeah, those would be my 2.
Nice. I know they're good things. I think they're very interesting, and see if one day we will achieve them. Second general point that we always ask is like learning from our mistakes. Because one of the things we see a lot is that we always talk very loudly about successes that we have. We don't talk so loudly about we mess up sometimes, things go different than we expected. At the same time, those are the learning experiences. So in your experience, both of you have had years of experience dealing with sustainable aviation and or the tourism industry. What's one thing that you've learned where something didn't quite turn out where you wanted it, and what have you learned from that? Jimena, can you take it first again?
Yeah, I think it's something I touched a bit today, which is not focusing on the negative only. I think it's easy for me to criticize and to be like, we should ban this and stop that. But it's a very difficult thing to focus on. Well, it's a very difficult message to receive, to say, you're not going to get this. So I think in talking to people about the need to change, we need to not only highlight the things that need to stop, but give the positive and hopeful message of what could be done differently. Because I think, I've had many conversations where I didn't get the results I needed, focusing on the things that need to be stopped, and then we need to do differently. I think it's always necessary to bring the message of what do you gain by doing things differently.
Nice. Tierney, what have you learned in your long working history?
So I think for me, it's always testing my assumptions. I think coming into aviation as a topic, I think I expected people to perceive things in a certain way, and maybe they didn't. I've just spent some time, as I said, conducting some research into how people think about aviation across Europe and what resonates with them around this topic. And I think there were some things that definitely I thought were going to resonate, and they did, but there were also some that I thought really would, and they really didn't. And so I think for me, it's always testing your assumptions, always putting the time in to understand who you're trying to connect with and what really works for them. Because I think too often in the climate space, we live in a little bit of a bubble, and I think we think that everyone thinks like us, and often that's not the case. I think that's a really important step that should never be overlooked.
Yeah, nice one. It's indeed that the bubbleization of society is also something that everybody has to deal with. Good to step out of it, and good to see that you also do that like regularly within your work. The next section is overrated, underrated. Very simple. It's basically what it says on the tin. Can you give us a concept of something that you think is underrated or overrated, and why? Jimena, do you have something in aviation sustainability that you think is massively under or overrated?
I would maybe start with overrated. I think the consumer's responsibility is massively overrated, such as there's a lot of campaigns that talk about, well, fly less or pack lighter, offset your flight with €5 and everything like that. And of course, we can all, as people, choose to act differently. However, I think it's overrated because we are all trapped in a system. And it's very, very difficult to choose differently if the system pushes you a certain way. And in that sense, the current system pushes you to travel more, think that traveling is your right, that you have to see everywhere you can see, you have to get places quickly, you have not enough holidays, therefore it's important that you maximize them. I think that's my overrated part.
Yeah, no, good one. It's always interesting to see how we, like the consumers, expected to do a lot of things, which may not always be possible, and we are all stuck in this efficiency narrative that this world drives us to, where we need to do everything in as little time as possible. Tierney, do you have one that you think is over or underrated?
Yeah, because Helena touched on carbon offsetting, and because we haven't really talked about that as a measure, I'll talk about that, which I also think is very overrated. I think offsets in theory can have a useful role if they're done very effectively, and they very much prioritise kind of long-term sustainable carbon storage. They can be a way to incentivize companies to emit less and reduce emissions elsewhere where they can't reduce them themselves. But the offset industry is currently plagued with problems, and it often overpromises and underdelivers. It's really hard to calculate, to verify, to monitor what we're doing in the offset system. And they're often used to promote business as usual and the continued use of high carbon activities, with companies choosing instead to kind of buy their way out of the problem rather than actually reducing their emissions. So while they might have a small role to play, I think they should only be reserved for those emissions and those sectors that really, really are unable to reduce through the transition, and should never be used as a first resort. And I think in aviation at the moment, they're being used far too much as an easy out and a first resort, and a way to engage with customers, because it's easy for them to tick a box and say they're going to spend an extra £5 to offset their emissions, where really that how much impact that is actually happening is probably very minimal and very hard to tell.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one indeed. It's the carbon offsetting debate. We haven't even touched up on it, but I think you've made some very true points there that are very useful to take into account. Then finally, to stay on a positive note, I would like to ask you, what's a source of inspiration for you? Something an example of somewhere that you've been that you thought was amazing. It can be a book, it can be a film, it can be a place, a statue, anything really. What is helping to inspire you on a day-to-day basis? Let's do again, Jimena. We're doing a Jimena one-on-one.
So I think a plan or an action that has really inspired me recently is in Germany you have this one ticket to travel per the entire month in German trains. I think at the moment it costs €59, and you can travel everywhere in Germany with that. I think it's a really lovely idea to incentivize train travel, reduce air travel, at least locally, and perhaps every country in Europe could have that, or we could have that Europe-wide as well. I think it has been and also I've seen some preliminary reports that it has been very effective as well, because price is one of the issues when choosing to travel by train. So taking that, subsidizing train travel heavily is a great thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. See if you can do this on a larger scale, or maybe even also with coaches, which of course also, we haven't really talked about it, but it's also a reasonably sustainable alternative if you feel not well enough.
True.
Yeah. Tierney, then what's your source of inspiration?
Yeah, so as someone that is spending most of their time telling stories, I'm actually going to go a bit rogue here, because I think one of the places that I've got a lot of information on aviation that is quite technical, but also distilled in a way that is really digestible, is actually from an organisation in the UK called the New Economics Foundation. And they do a lot of really interesting research into the economics behind, many things, but aviation is something that they've been focusing on. So they've been able to show really clearly in the UK the kind of how much does the economic argument behind aviation growth stand up, and have actually been able to show that it doesn't. And they've also done some really interesting work with some other organisations on the frequent flyer levy, particularly, and how that would actually work in practice, and what that would actually look like, and the sorts of funds that would generate, and the money that would generate. And I found that really great as a way to kind of back up a lot of what we're trying to say about aviation, and the more kind of storytelling side of things that I like to do. That gives us the kind of confidence that we can go out there and talk about it in the way that we do, because they've done all the fantastic research behind it, which is great.
Nice. Well, thanks for that. That's two very different but both very inspirational examples. Really nice to hear about that. And to end the podcast on this, that is, unless there are some things which still need to be said. Is there anything you still want to add? Do you think we've not talked about this, or we've talked about this too much, or something else? Now is your chance, and otherwise, we're not.
I actually do have one thing that is nice to look at when we're talking about aviation and urban tourism, is that both, airlines and airports, they rely on the attractivity of a destination to grow their operations, basically. So there's a lot of marketing efforts done in order to promote destinations. And I think that's an angle that we need to maybe research more or look at, because it's about driving demand in urban areas, basically. And when we are talking about over tourism, precisely, there's a big overlap there that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, interesting one. That's a need. We need to again broaden our scope and really look beyond what we would normally look at.
I think, can I add one?
Of course you can.
Because I think we've touched on it a little bit, but we went quite deep on sustainable fuels, and we went quite deep on policy measures and taxation. But one thing I guess to note is obviously, as you said right at the beginning, around things like electrifying flight, hydrogen, etc. Those are the kind of technologies that are really going to get us towards zero emission and for the aviation sector. And I think a lot of the emphasis and a lot of the policy at the moment is very much on those fuels. And I think we still need a lot more focus and a lot more kind of policy incentives going into actually also bringing those longer term technologies that are really going to revolutionize this sector online, and to bring those into play, because I think there's a lot of potential there, but those technologies are still very much in their infancy. And I think in many other areas of climate change, we like to talk about things being decades away, but they're only decades away because the policy structures aren't there to bring that forward and to make all that more ambitious and to put more ambitious timelines on it. So I would also say that's an area that definitely also needs to be explored alongside fuels and taxation and demand management measures.
Nice. That's a good one. Good final point. With that, I would like to thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion about a topic that is very difficult, but also very necessary to talk about. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the new narratives that are coming out of this. And I think you're both working on that from different aspects, from different angles. And I think that's very interesting to see. So hopefully keep up the good work, keep on working towards interesting new ways of talking about this and also re-engaging with all ways, as you were saying, Jimena, of like engaging with this and engaging with people. Thank you very much. And let's continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bedankt voor het luisteren naar deze aflevering van de Urban Tourism Podcast. Als je verder wilt praten of je wilt met ons in contact komen, dan horen we dat graag. Neem daarvoor contact met ons op via ensut@inholland.nl of klik op de link in de show notes. Tot ziens en we hopen snel van jullie te horen.